These are all real people, they're just like you and me. These kind of things could happen to anyone. I think when people think of Playboy or Playmates, they just think of like beautiful women and just very one-dimensional, sex symbols, but these are real people and they live real lives. And for me personally, I saw it as a stepping stone to Hollywood. I saw it as a thing I could do that would make me feel beautiful and glamorous, and something I could do that would be exciting and fun, and something to do while I was young. But sometimes tragic things happen, and I think real human stories should be told. When I first heard of the idea for the Playboy Murders, the producers showed me the cases they were thinking about covering, and they were cases that I had never heard of, and that really surprised me because I thought I knew everything about Playboy's history and about what happened to all the Playmates and things like that, and it made me wonder if they were buried in any way. So that's always, a bad feeling, and it makes you want to help tell these stories for the people that aren't around to tell them anymore. 3 words I would use to describe the Playboy Murders on ID are shocking, compelling, and surprisingly real, because these are all real people. They're just like you and me. These kind of things could happen to anyone, and there's just something so compelling and engaging about that. We're living in a time where everyone has a voice now, whether it's through social media or just expanding media in general. And we can hear the stories of real people who maybe didn't get that attention before because maybe the powers that be didn't want these stories out, or maybe, they weren't thought of as something that was important in the news cycle at the time. There's no way that Hef and Playboy weren't aware of all these stories, just because I know that they did collect, all the media and the press clippings and anything ever mentioned having to do with the brand. But of course they weren't focused on because they weren't positive stories, but I think they're important stories to tell. The story of Stacey Arthur sticks with me the most, just because, she was in such a positive relationship with her husband, and he was so incredibly supportive of her, and they were both so, ambitious and hardworking, and this tragedy just tore all that apart. One of the really tragic things about Jasmine Fiore's story is, she was somebody who, by all accounts, was in love, and this attack came from the person who was closest to her, and, they were wrapped up in like some fame and drugs and fast lifestyle and things like that, and it's really scary when, your murderer could be your partner. These are definitely really important cautionary tales for people who might want to go after fame or exposure. A lot of negativity can come with that, and I think from the outside, people don't see that. Like when I would see people on TV growing up, I thought they just had it made, and like if you're famous, you're automatically rich and you're automatically protected and you're automatically safe, and that's not the case at all for so many people. And I think that's important to know. I think fame isn't necessarily the most desirable thing, as some people think it might be. When I lived at the mansion, I felt safe in a lot of ways because you're living in this big house, behind a private gate with security. But sometimes, and I've learned this through the stories we're covering, sometimes that can be like a false sense of security for some of the women who are involved, because then after having all this exposure, they just go back to their normal lives where they don't have that security and they don't have that protection, and that can be a big adjustment sometimes, especially when fans and people who buy the magazine, sometimes there's people out there with, different ideas about what their accessibility should be. I was really surprised to learn about the 1-900 number. That took place about 10 or 15 years before I was involved with Playboy, and to me it was kind of surprising. It kind of seemed like something that didn't really align with what I understood the Playmate brand to be. It seemed a little accessible, or too accessible, especially during a time period where a 1-900 number was thought of generally as like a sex line. That didn't really seem appropriate to me. It seemed like it was giving people a little too much access, especially since these women were making the calls from their own homes. So I was really surprised to learn about that. I I think I realized there was a dark side to Playboy probably like after, my first night out with the group or right when I moved in. But I wanted it to be better, and I wanted, when you're young, you feel like, okay, well, this is just like I have to be a hard worker and I have to, make it in the world or do what I have to do. But, as time went on, over the years, you just kind of realize where the actual problems lie. I feel like all this backstory that's coming out about the Playboy world is really surprising to a lot of people. But when I lived at the mansion for 7 years, that involved some very dark times for me. And because I experienced those things, it makes me feel like I can resonate with these stories a little bit. And it really makes me want to share these real people's stories. For me, the best part of being affiliated with Playboy is just the female friendships I've taken away from it. I mean, one of my best friends who I do a podcast with today is Bridget, who lived at the mansion with me 20 years ago. We're still friends and we're still reconnecting with all these women we knew back then. And, 20 years later, it's like we never stopped talking. I think that's a really positive thing I've taken from my experience. People should watch the Playboy Murders because these are real stories about real people who sadly aren't around to tell their own story anymore. There's something we can learn from these stories because these things could happen to anybody. And I feel like so many of these stories didn't get the attention that they deserve. People want to hear everybody's story. People want to hear the truth.